We see increased interest in frontier and emerging producers now that we have a bit of recovery in the oil price. So the factors shaping risks for those investments are something that's getting a bit more of renewed discussion, particularly in Africa and Latin America. Now, a lot of the factors that impact interest in frontier producers are outside of government control. So their geology, the oil price, technological advances. But what these governments can control is the design and the marketing of the upstream opportunities they offer to make them as attractive as possible to investors. So this includes not only your fiscal and your contractual terms, but also the regulatory pathways that allow investors to access acreage, undertake exploration, and move any discoveries into production. Now, since 2014, in the frontier producers that have been able to um, continue to attract upstream investment, we see a few key similarities. One is that they have the ability to expedite contract awards. The other is that they have relative regulatory clarity. And the third is that they tend to have flexibility in how they apply their contract terms. So when you combine at least relative success with these three factors and competitive to semi-competitive fiscal terms, you generally have a more attractive investment prospect. And this explains not only the frontier and emerging producers that are attracting investment now, but even some of the differences in activity we see in common geological zones that multiple frontier producers share. Yeah, in a word, we could, yes. I think there are prospects to see something like a Permian outside of North America, but of course, designing the above ground conditions that allow large production from a mature basin is challenging. So the IHS Market PEPS team actually undertook a study to answer this very question earlier this year. So we designed a framework of 32 indicators to measure above ground conditions relevant to the prospects for redeveloping these basins. And we looked at 17 superbasins outside of North America. So what is a superbasin? A superbasin is something that our upstream team um, created. It basically was based on a survey of over 500 significant basins globally, identifying 25 of what we deem to be superbasins. So these are basins that have produced at least 5 billion barrels of oil equivalent thus far. They have at least that much 2P conventional reserves remaining. They also have tight and unconventional potential on top of that. They have stacked horizons. They have at least 2 working petroleum systems. So we have 25 basins meeting all those criteria, 17 of which are outside of North America. So for our study, we looked at those 17 basins plus one, what we call a tier 2 basin, a little bit smaller, Eromanga in Australia. And our indicator framework really allowed us to understand 5 factors that are crucial to these basins being successfully developed that are within government control. So we have governor motivation, so the commitment of the host government to expand E&P activity and production. We have access, so whether or not investors can access high quality opportunities across asset types and at varying stages of maturity. We have critical contract terms. Now, this is the most complicated one because it's around designing terms that really suit your geology, investor decision-making cycles, and above-ground risk across the mix of conventional and unconventional resources that characterize most of these basins. We also have competitor mix, so the government's ability to attract and retain an investor mix that is necessary to provide the technology and the activity levels to drive commercial learning in these basins. It's also about the host government's ability to determine the optimal role for the national oil company within that mix. And finally, we have social license, so the willingness of civil society to accept not just more E&P activity in these basins, but use of hydraulic fracturing. So when we stack up all of our indicators across those 5 factors, we identified a couple of basins from a purely above ground, not a commercial perspective, that have more positive prospects for having some kind of redevelopment along the lines of the Permian. And these are Neuquén in Argentina and Eromanga in Australia. Now, these 2 basins are quite interesting because they share some similar characteristics. So they're by far the smallest in terms of remaining reserves of our international superbasins. They also, in both cases, have upside that's dominated by unconventionals. So you really need to master tight and shale resources in these basins to recognize that redevelopment potential. They also face similar risks to their current approach. So these are our only two international super basins where hydrocarbon rights are held by local rather than central governments, so the states and the provinces. This raises challenges with policy continuity as well as social license, because you not only need to maintain a favorable policy environment at the local level, you need it at the federal level as well, and you need alignment between the two. And then we have concerns about the sensitivity of local governments to local civil society concerns around these basins. So the answer is yes, you could see another basin developed like the Permian. It won't be easy. There's a lot of room to improve on these terms and conditions we're looking at. And the basins that, from an above ground perspective, have the best prospects of doing that are also much smaller than the Permian. So they wouldn't have the same kind of impact on global oil supplies as the Permian has. There's a lot of risks that are shaping investment opportunities in Asia at the moment. I'll highlight three sort of notable ones. I think the first is elections. So we have elections in a lot of key producer states next year. So India, Indonesia, Thailand, and Australia. In India, the election outcome will have a big impact on continued upstream reform momentum, as well as the implementation of the new hydrocarbon exploration and licensing policy. In Indonesia, the new government will be drafting a new oil and gas law. So, how nationalist that government is has implications for what happens with domestic market obligations and what happens with the role of the national oil company, Pertamina. So, whether or not Pertamina also becomes a national gas aggregator and potentially also the upstream regulator. In Thailand, we have elections as well, and the new government there will be determining the use of the three contract types Thailand now has, and also access to some long delayed upstream opportunities there. And finally, we have Australia. So, in Australia, the new government will have a big role in shaping environmental and climate change regulations, how the petroleum rent resource tax might be modified, particularly affecting new gas investments, and finally, requirements for public consultation for offshore developments, which is going to be an emerging requirement of E&P investors in Australia's offshore going forward. So elections are a big driver of change in the region.